Okay, guys, all you COVIDites who were not there on the first day of class, and I know it's not your fault, and that's just life. But we got to do something. So I'm going to do just a real short version of week 1, unit 1, and this one actually blends into the one that I've already pushed out yet last night. Maybe some of you have already seen it. So you're here in the kitchen, and I just got home, and I'm going to grab and try to do this. I'm going to have my lunch at the same time, and so on and so forth. So let's just we'll go through the material, and this is we're going to talk about the course syllabus. We'll talk about textbooks. We're going to talk about the labs and the rules for ship handling, and we'll see how far we can get here. Let's move me off to the side. You don't need to see me anymore. And here's the syllabus. And I'm going to grab my sandwich because I just made a fresh tomato and cheese sandwich that I am not. Look at this. Fresh tomato and cheese sandwich. Well, you can't see it, but you can hear me eating it. All right. Let's start at the top. NS345. Here we go. So you know where my office is. You know my email. That's my office phone, but probably my mobile is okay. And already some of you have reached out to me by text. This is how I pushed out the information on the textbooks. It's been handed out in class. It's also in module number 1 in a digital PDF form. 80% of the class grade comes from exams. There are multiple exams, and you can find the syllabus online, and maybe we can take a quick look at that. 20% comes from the lab, and this is pretty traditional the way we break up the grades. Attendance is mandatory, so that's why I'm doing this for you, because I'll be taking attendance, and we got to deal with the lab stuff. I don't know what to do on that. You guys need to be really connected on the face-to-face. I mean, you guys need to be like asynchronous online heroes. I'll do my part. You do your part. I'm going to fix that right there. Yeah, so no absences, but there you go. The next thing, there is a rubric for lab that I showed in class, and it has to do with, acceptable, distinguished, good, minimal, and unacceptable. And that's how you're going to get your course grade. Back here at the very last bullet, I asked, and I hope you thought about that, do you have any rules for ship handling? Some people had said, well, speed kills. Some people had said, any docking that you can walk away from is a good docking. Okay. I don't know. So here's my rules. Put me back in the picture here. Go slow. Think ahead. Be patient. These are my rules for ship handling, and these didn't just come upon, because I thought about them today. I've been living and practicing boat handling all my life. I started going to working on a boat and being taught by a captain when I was about 14 years old, and then around boats all my life. And go slow. I heard this a lot of different places in a lot of different ways, and I boiled this down to just this stuff. Go slow, think ahead. I'm going to ask you to memorize that. I'm going to ask you to, get it deep inside you. I'm going to ask you to do it on a test. I'm going to ask you to write that down exactly as that is. I gave an example in class about my son, who's now much older than you, in his mid-30s. And he was about 17 years old over in Penobscot. And he drove his car off the road and was hanging upside down by his seatbelts. And he was able to get him and his buddy. They weren't hurt, and they went up to a house and they called me. They were only about 2 miles away from where we lived. And, he was pretty, the car was wrecked, and, but he was okay. So I went to pick him up, and it was a kind of a slippery, slushy snowstorm, late snowstorm, and that Blue Hill Road, Castine to Blue Hill Road, it was right there. And he's kind of sniffling and sobbing a little bit. He's pretty shook up, and he says, "Dad, I don't know why this stuff always happens to me." And I said, "Well, that's son, because you were going too fast." No, I was going slow. Well, you're upside down, hanging by your seatbelts in the ditch. You are going too fast. If you hit the dock and you cause damage and it makes you feel uncomfortable when you actually do damage, you are going too fast. If there's any problem, you are going too fast. Think about that. Let's think ahead. Let's look ahead. Let's think ahead. Let's not just be reacting all the time, but let's have a plan in our head, and a good plan. And then be patient. Let's let the boat do what you just asked it to do. You put the throttle ahead with a boat. The boat doesn't just go ahead right then. You have to think what it's the delay and the parts of the components that have to happen to make that maneuver. You have to overcome wind. You have to work with the current. You have to be patient and let the boat do what you asked it to do, and then move on to the next step. You should be planning well enough so that that happens. Go slow, think ahead, be patient. The stuff we're going to talk about is we're coming up on pivot point, then we'll talk about transverse thrust, and we'll get as far as we can. So we're doing pretty good today. I'm giving you sort of the quick version. Take a look at this slide. So slide says, what does this slide make you think about? Well, the answer is, this is to me, this is like a graphic syllabus. This is all the forces that affect a ship when we're ship handling, tugs and anchors and anchoring, thrusters, shallow water squat, current, rudder and propulsion, channel effect, wind, interaction between ships. All those things come into play. This is like a graphic syllabus, and that's what I think about when I see this. Let's talk about the pivot point. Now you know about fulcrums. You learned this in physics, but you know what? You really learned about this kind of stuff. This looks like kind of a feng shui, really clever. But the balance point is what I'm talking about. And you learned this on the playground. Evan, I'm talking to you. You learned this on the playground. All of you guys learned this on the playground. You learned about the fat kid and the skinny kid on the teeter-totter. You learned that you could adjust where you sat on the fulcrum or where you sat on the seesaw board. You didn't know that, excuse me for eating, but I'm hungry, guys. You didn't know that what you learned in the playground, as you figured out as a little kid, would come back and be important in ship handling? Well, it is. It has to do with this point, this fulcrum, this pivot point where my cursor is right now. I'm going to pause for a little bit. I want to show you something. So I'm sitting here in the kitchen. I'm eating this as my sandwich, but look who's in the background. I put her up on the stool so she could watch this. She's been kind of missing her guy. But I'm eating this sandwich, and you can see just how. Look at that tomato sandwich. She's a pretty good dog. She's not spoiled, but she's she's definitely she's a good dog in the woods, but she's also a good dog in the house. Wait, I'll get you something. You can't have my cheese sandwich, but you can have this. All right. Let's come back to me. So what we're talking about was that pivot point and how important that is. Now the pivot point of a ship can either be, here in the middle. It could be up on the bow. It could be in the middle. It could be at the bow. It could be at the stern. Not at the bow, not at the stern, but towards the bow. It moves around. It shifts location depending on the movement of the vessel. It's called the peripatetic pivot point. One of the textbooks I read talks about that. Now, peripatetic is a word that means wandering. Peripatetic means the wandering pivot point. And what causes it to wander? Well, first of all, let's work a little bit more on what the pivot point is. A way of thinking about it is a vertical center of rotation. The ship rotates around wherever the pivot point. If this bar or this rod that went up through the middle of the ship, if you were a captain of a tanker or a big ship like that, you might have something like this as a weather vane up on top of your house, the north, south, east, and west, up on your barn. You'd think you were really clever. And you would be. And you'd have a really cool weather vane. The ship would point into the wind, that kind of stuff. The old farmers people had that kind of stuff. All right. So it's called a vertical center of rotation. And when a ship will pivot around its vertical center of rotation, it's also known as the pivot point. If we take a different view and we look at it this way, we see there's the star, that's the pivot point. Now, I got to tell you, this is the pivot point for a vessel which is dead in the water. You're not moving, DIW. You have no speed through the water. The pivot point for that vessel is basically at the vessel's center of gravity. That's assuming the vessel is on an even keel and properly located. Now, as you can see in the diagram or on the slide, it might be, 5 or 10 feet off, but basically right there at the center of gravity. Here's something else I want you to think. There's the little, I minimized the pivot point, but there it is right there. And I made a big point out of this in class, but you all know that if the bow goes to starboard, the stern's going to port. If the bow goes to starboard, the stern's going to port. Well, let's not forget about this. And your lab instructors will talk about that. But sooner or later, you'll be so focused on what the bow's doing, you'll forget about what the stern is doing. As it slams into the dock, or as the tug, the steel of the tug drags along the stern of the side of the ship, causing, maybe some paint damage, but hopefully not any steel-to-steel damage. Let's just remember, this is rotational movement. The bow goes this way, and the stern goes that way, and it rotates around the pivot, wherever the pivot point is. For a vessel moving ahead, the pivot point shifts up here to the bow, and it'll move forward. And the rule of thumb is 1/4 to 1 ship length from the bow is the rule of thumb. That pivot point, if we look at the entire length of the ship, let's say it's a 1,000-foot ship, it's going to be 1/4 to 1/3. Let's see, 1/4 of 1,000, that's 250 feet. 1/3 is 333 feet. So somewhere between 250 and 333 feet, that's where the pivot point will be almost all the time in normal conditions, loaded conditions, everything's good. That's where it's going to be. It's going to be up in that part of the vessel. Look at this picture, because we're going to go and we're going to talk about why that is. Now, as I look at this picture, you can see that this is this vessel coming right directly at you. You can perceive, you can understand that there's a big resistance to that ship moving through the water. We can see the bow wave. We can see that bow wave churning up a surf and a spray. That's that water pressure created. That resistance is clearly shown right there. It's all over the bow, but we could boil it down to one point right in this general location. And that actually has a name. It is called the center of longitudinal resistance. It's right there. It's the blue circle. It's right there, the center of longitudinal resistance. It's right there on the skin of the ship at the bow. Meanwhile, you got the center of gravity back here. You know, these are kind of fixed, right? And halfway between them, equally located between the center of longitudinal resistance and the center of gravity, is the pivot point, the yellow dot. If either one of those changes, if this changes or if this changes, and maybe we'll talk about how that could change, then you would experience a shift in your pivot point. If you were going astern, if you were moving astern, and now the center of longitudinal resistance, because you are going astern, the center of longitudinal resistance would shift towards, again, it would be about 1/3 to 1/4 of a ship length from the stern. Got that? There's a unique thing which happens when we start to turn, and this will just be a little extra, but as ship handlers and college students, this is the kind of stuff that I would expect you to know. As a vessel skids through a turn, and a vessel does skid, there's a sideways component. And you can see, you can imagine that aircraft carrier in that hard left turn, skidding through that turn sideways. There is a sideways component. I'm going to show it as this, as this, as this. I'm talking about the entire, there is greater pressure built up along the side of the hull, and because of the fact that the vessel is also simultaneously moving through the water. You know, maybe you're a snowboarder or a snow skier, maybe you water ski, maybe you wakeboard. Whatever you do of something like that, you know about turning and you know about that skidding force. Maybe you drive motorcycles, or maybe you race motorcycles, dirt bikes. You know about skidding through a turn. You've experienced this type of stuff. So, when you are skidding through a turn, the center of longitudinal resistance probably moves back to about here. Now that shifts everything around. The center of gravity hasn't moved, but the pivot point has shifted back. It probably was right around here, but it has shifted back a little bit off the center line and also to this location. So there's a little fine point that I was talking about in the class. We're almost done with this lecture. Next topic that we got into, and I've skipped some of the illustrations that I did and some of the jokes I told. So guys, we'll just try to keep you up with what you need. The bare minimum here. Make sure you read the text. It's interesting to way to think about the pivot point is to think about the tug-ship relationship. And that's where I picked up in that discussion. You'll know that if you've watched the second lecture already, you'll know that's what it comes to. A ship handler must think about the horsepower and the placement of the tugs. And if we go back, I want to go back to this beginning diagram that I used. If I go back to this, and I just said a ship handler has to think about the strength or the force that the tug can deliver, and also the placement. It also has to do with the pivot point. This pile of rocks here weighs more than this rock here. It can deliver, this pile of rock on this seesaw, or on this lever, on this balance beam, can deliver more downward force. But because it has a shorter lever compared to this one, which, although it's a smaller force, it has a longer lever. Now, you've studied this in physics and you know this stuff, but there is, imagine this is not a plank which is balanced on a balance beam, but imagine this is the side of a ship. This is a tug with a lot of horsepower. This is a tug with less horsepower pushing on the side of the ship, and you start to see where that next lecture was going. Let's move down here. We talked about all different types of stuff, you know, the placement of the tug alongside the ship, the placement of the tug alongside the ship, and I actually ended up with this one, and that's where we started the next lecture. So there you go. That's going to bring you up to speed. Now, guys, you, like I said, you need to be, first of all, you need to lock into me. If I post something, you need to give me a thumbs up. You need to demonstrate it. It needs to be on the record. As a matter of fact, it's going to be best if you probably send me an email once a week and saying, I watched all the videos, because people are going to be looking at you and saying, did you meet the STCW competencies? So that's what I'm talking about. I just said the STCW competency. I mean, you guys are, why did it have to be you guys? But you know, you got to watch yourself, and it's not your fault, but you still have to do the right. You still have to do the right thing. You need to be just tuned in to this online process and reading the textbook, so that we together, me and you, and your department, you know, all the professors behind you. This is true of all your courses. You just need to be, you need to be like study buddies and get this done. And we need to document that you watched all this stuff and you do well on the test. It's just so important. I'm sorry that you have to go through this. You know, that was not your thing that you were looking forward to. But we will help you, and I'm here for you. Everybody's got my numbers, and we'll just. I would recommend that you. Well, it's a little late now. If you've already watched number 2, you should watch this one. You should also watch the pre-video. And let's take a look before I leave. Let's take a look at the syllabus. Hang on just a minute. Okay, so here's an image of the syllabus, and what we want to do is that we want to drop down lower in that syllabus. So I'm going to see if I can do that here. I'm going to slide down. We're going to go through all the stuff that we have to do for the STCW competencies, and I'm going to get here to. I'm going to get to this thing. Here's week 1. Here's the topics and assessment. I don't know if you guys can see that. I hope you can. But the syllabus is in Canvas, and you want to be reading chapter 1 out of the text, Notes on Ship Handling, which is also available in Canvas. And you can see we're talking about pivot point, rudders, propellers, docking maneuvers, so on and so forth. What I want to do is I want to zoom in on this. I'm going to see if I can do that. Hang on. I don't think I've ever done that particular maneuver before with this program, and I'm hoping that when I review it that I'm kind of enlarged. But you see, right here, what happens, I want to talk about the exam. So our first exam is on week 3. It says exam 1.1 in class, 30-minute exam. It's going to be on September 14th, covering lecture and reading from weeks 1 and 2. And then we're going to go on. We're going to talk about turning, advance and transfer, sea trials, turning circles, tactical and final diameters, and stuff like that. So that's going to be that exam. It's actually happening in 2 parts. There's 1.1 and 1.2. That's going to make up the total exam. The reason I'm doing that is because our feedback that I got and everybody got at the end of our first online go-around was that we probably ought to break up and have more exams and spread them out. So exam 1.2 is going to be online. It's going to be on Canvas. It's going to be due at time 23:59 on a week later on the 23rd, which is Wednesday, just approaching midnight. It's covering lecture from week 3, lectures and PowerPoints. Up here, it's covering this material. it's covering this material. Okay? Alrighty. So, and then we're going to progress through the semester, and you'll see that the next two exams are done the same way. Exam number 3 is done totally in class, but exam at the end of the semester, that exam is going to be, on week 12. It's going to be a exam on Monday and an exam on Wednesday. We don't have a final exam in this class, so there you go. I hope that helps, and I hope you be well, and I'll see you soon. Let's just stay connected. Give me a call, give me a shout, give me an email. Talk to you later.